Senator from Utah.
Mr. President, I would like to express my disapproval of the President's request of a debt limit increase of $1.2 trillion, which would place the total limit just below $16.4 trillion. The requested increase amounts to nearly $4,000 of additional debt for every American man and woman and child. And the total debt limit being requested works out to over $50,000 per person. Now, this would be a terrible burden to impose on our children. For many in Washington, including this president, this debt limit increase is just a matter of fact necessity, as we've just heard. Watching the mainstream media, many Americans might be surprised to even know that it was set to happen. But this is no small matter. This is not an inconsequential increase in federal spending. Federal spending is already out of control. We all know it. Our total debt is already greater than the size of our entire economy. I'm going to repeat that. Our total debt is greater than the size of our entire economy. And the debt ceiling increase being requested amounts to nearly 8% of our entire gross domestic product, or GDP, and the total debt limit being requested amounts to over 108% of GDP, which would place us in worse shape than many of the Eurozone countries currently confronting their devastating fiscal crisis, or this devastating fiscal crisis. Given the recent experience in Europe, it is disconcerting to hear repeated calls by the grow government at all costs crowd to double down on failed government initiatives to stimulate the economy by borrowing even more. Rates are cheap, they say, so let's continue riding this debt bubble as far as we can. Mr. President, we should have learned from the housing bubble and the European sovereign debt bubble that bubbles pop rapidly and with great devastation. It was not long ago that the grow government crowd was mocking concerns about indebtedness in the Eurozone, taunting what they called, quote, bond vigilantes, unquote, and saying that there was nothing there to see. Interest rates won't go up, don't worry. Rates are low, so borrow and spend. We know how this story ends. It was not long ago that we saw housing market participants lured by the promise of an ever bigger McMansion, being told, don't worry, rates are low and house prices never fall, and the government backs your mortgage, so there is no risk. As outsized and highly speculative activity took place throughout the housing and financial sectors, federal regulators ignored all warnings, failed to use their existing authorities to promote safety and soundness, and frankly failed to do their jobs. To date, it is difficult, if not impossible, to come up with a single name of a regulator who lost a job. In fact, many in the top slots got promotions. Meanwhile, everything bad that exists in the housing market and in mortgage finance is blamed on the evils of private business. That's a great way to deflect regulatory failure, but a terrible way to get private activity back into the housing area and arena. The fact is, the housing bubble was caused by too much borrowing and the folks that egged it on. And the results were not pretty. Global investors struck against mortgage-backed securities issued in the United States, leading ultimately to a precipitous global strike on financial intermediation and massive government bailouts of financial institutions. The experience with the housing bubble caused by mortgage debt is being replicated with the explosion of sovereign debt. The bond vigilantes did strike against profligate Eurozone countries, and they precipitously demanded higher and higher interest rates to protect lenders from risks of default. This effectively shut entire countries out of the debt market. Entire countries face an inability to borrow at rates that they can sustain. Absent an ability to roll over debt, those countries have been forced to quickly and violently into fiscal restructuring, immediate austerity, and sometimes even partial default. The President's most recent request to take on more debt follows the same bubble pattern that we know will lead to devastation and losses. I, for one, do not wish for us to continue flirting with catastrophe by encouraging bubbles with the fool's gold that because rates are cheap, we should borrow more. We are on the edge of the cliff, and it is time to carefully but deliberately take a few steps back. Rates may be low today, but they can turn on a dime. And when they do, the outsized federal government that we currently have will suddenly be exposed as unaffordable. And when that day comes, our creditors can go on strike as quickly as they have in Europe. Last summer, we got a taste of what it is to come when we received the first downgrade of U.S. sovereign debt in history from a major credit rating agency. Americans can never be allowed to forget that this downgrade occurred under and because of this administration's fiscal stewardship. We cannot risk what are likely to be further downgrades in the near future by raising the debt limit. Mr. President, it's time to resist the siren song of cheap credit and put our focus back on the job at hand, which is to allow the private sector to create jobs and get rid of the $1 trillion plus deficits of the Obama presidency, to get rid of our mountain of debt that surpasses the size of our entire economy, and to bring the size of our federal government back to its historical norms. Federal outlays as a share of our entire economy averaged 18.6% over the past 40 years. Under the current administration, federal outlays represent 25% of GDP in 2009, 23.8% in 2010, and were estimated to have been 25.3% in 2011. The current administration has engineered a federal government whose outlays represent 25%, 1/4 of our entire economy. The last time federal spending represented such a large share of our economy was back in 1946, as the world began rebuilding after the ravages of World War II. I guess this is what one of my colleagues meant when he said the other day that America is in good shape. Economic and job growth remain weak, but Washington and government jobs it funds is doing just fine. The administration likes to talk about economic fairness, about the haves and the have-nots. But ultimately, the people in the best shape in this economy are those who owe their livelihoods to the federal government and federal taxpayers. When the 99% are being taxed to fund and fuel an ever-growing Washington bureaucracy, we have what the president might call economic justice. And there is no end in sight. After federal spending spiked in World War II, as the entire nation mobilized to defeat the Axis powers, it quickly ratcheted down, with federal spending averaging 16.5% of GDP in the 10 years that followed. Yet with President Obama, the ratchet only moves in one direction, and that is up. Equally of interest is the behavior of federal spending relative to the size of the economy in those Clinton years, which many look back on as the golden age of fiscal correctness. While Democrats focus solely on the existence of budgetary bliss, despite higher tax rates under Clinton, they typically fail to mention how the budgetary bliss was generated. It is difficult to deny the facts, and the facts include a reduction in federal outlays relative to GDP from 21.4% in 1993 to 18.2% by 2001, a 3.2 percentage point reduction. During those years, government receipts relative to GOP did rise from 17.5% to 19.5%, a 2.0 percentage point increase, but it is impossible to deny that the budget bliss was largely generated by reducing the share of the economy accounted for by federal spending. Of course, my friends on the other side of the aisle pledge allegiance to tax and spend economics. They wish to maintain a federal government whose spending amounts to 1/4 of the size of the entire economy. To them, federal spending and big government are not problems. They are virtues from which good things trickle down from government to preferred classes of people. They decry that a deep recession has caused government receipts as a share of GDP to fall below 15%, and argue in panic that the decline is proof that taxes must be raised, while refusing to acknowledge that the nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office projects that revenues as a share of GDP will rise with economic recovery. Revenues as a share of GDP will rise with economic recovery. Federal revenues have averaged 18% of GDP over the past 40 years. They are projected by our Congressional Budget Office to reach nearly 19% of GDP in 2013, 21% in 2021, and 23% by 2035. Under current law, that's what they say. And I think that's crazy. That has never been the case in the past. Even under the CBO's so-called alternative fiscal scenario, CBO puts revenues as a share of GDP at around 18.4%, higher than the long-run average. Congress and the President should focus on the things that they are capable of controlling. Mr. President, federal revenues come from the economy, and as the economy recovers, CBO expects revenues to recover and rise above historical norms relative to the size of the economy. The President and his allies are putting the cart before the horse. They want to increase revenues by raising taxes, but the real way to increase revenues is to promote economic growth. Federal spending is something that Congress and the President have full control over, however. Every federal dollar spent comes because Congress and the President decide to spend it. Our deficits and debt are on an unsustainable path because of unsustainable spending. Yet with this debt limit increase, the President and his allies are confirming that they are comfortable with our government consuming an ever-increasing share of the economy. The President has made clear before that in the name of class warfare, he is comfortable raising taxes regardless of whether those tax hikes generate revenues or decrease deficits and debt. And with his latest proposal to tax the so-called rich, he has shown again that he is willing to ignore the clear fact, that we have a spending, not a revenue problem. To tackle our spending problem, unsustainable government promises embedded in entitlement programs like Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security must be reformed. There is no budget analyst on this planet who does not identify entitlement reform as key to getting the federal budget back on track. Yet over the 3 years of the Obama presidency, there has been no plan. No plan from the administration to deal with entitlements. The entitlement can is simply being kicked down the road, and to deflect attention from our real fiscal challenges, my friends on the other side of the aisle resort to the politics of division. Tax the evil banks, and all will be equal, just, and fair, they suggest. Tax millionaires and billionaires, no matter whether they are fat cats on yachts or small business owners, and all will be equal, just, and fair, they suggest. This politics of division bears no fruit. It is an economic dead end, yet it is elevated to the top of the President's agenda to divert attention from our bloated federal government. The taxes on the so-called rich or on evil financial institutions or evil energy producers or evil insurance providers have been promoted in the interest of fairness and equality. Reducing income and wealth inequality is a laudable goal. Yet my friends on the other side of the aisle have not, and I repeat, have not proposed new tax measures to generate greater income equality through the tax code. The numerous permanent surtaxes on the so-called rich or on energy producers or on financial institutions have not been offered with corresponding permanent reductions in taxes for others with lesser means. Rather, they have been offered to promote more government spending and a permanently larger government. They are permanent tax hikes used to pay for temporary stimulus or taxes on business to fuel more spending or bailouts or government jobs. Of course, no mention is made of what effects those taxes have on businesses or private sector job creation. No mention is made about the effects those taxes have on the returns on retirement portfolios of seniors, which contain stocks and bonds of the vilified bankers and energy producers and insurance companies. The message to retired seniors in Sandy, Utah is clear. You've been suffering for years through near zero returns on bonds because of Federal Reserve policy. But now you will just have to take it on the chin when the value of your pension falls because the federal government needs to tax business to get more revenue for union construction jobs or stimulus or for bailouts of mortgages of speculative housing investors. Mr. President, my friends on the other side of the aisle say they want more equality and more jobs, but do not offer tax proposals that would generate more equality through the tax code or a better environment for job creation. Instead, they want to tax the so-called rich to get money for things like high-paid infrastructure contractors while fighting tooth and nail on behalf of their union constituencies to retain and even expand Davis-Bacon and Contract Service Act coverage, which we know costs taxpayers money and stifles job creation. These types of schemes have nothing to do with equality. They have nothing to do with promoting as much job creation as possible. They have everything to do with the politics of division and with cronyism. I just chatted with one of the major contractors in this country who basically is out of business right now because banks aren't lending, can't borrow for projects. And that contractor said he's never going to go union again because it costs 25 to 30% more and the work is not as good. The workmanship is not as good. That's hard for me to believe because I was raised in the union movement. I learned a skilled trade as a young man. I worked in the building construction trade unions for 10 years. We were proud of the work we did. Of course, that was lath and plaster. I was a metal lather. That no longer exists. I remember fellow union members coming up to me and workers saying, "Hey, kids, slow down. We're not going to have any work if you keep working as fast and as hard as you do." Well, not only do they not have any work, those trades aren't in existence anymore except in very, very small specialties. A number of contractors have told me that they have to pay a lot more for union work that isn't any better than the non-union work. And yet we're stuck with Davis-Bacon that requires basically union pay in certain areas, and they broaden those areas way beyond the initial intentions of the bill. Now, these types of schemes have nothing to do with equality. They have nothing to do with promoting as much job creation as possible. They have everything to do with the politics of division and with cronyism. Now, I don't mean to stand here and demean my fellow union members, many of whom are really good artisans and really good skilled workers, but there's no question it costs a lot more. And there's a real question whether the work is any better than non-union work that costs a lot less. But we know who this administration wants to support. I look at this Indiana situation with the Super Bowl, and the union's threatening to shut down the Super Bowl. My gosh, how stupid can you be? If they do that, that'll irritate everybody in America. But nevertheless, they want the publicity that comes from shutting down the Super Bowl. Well, I hope my union members will think it through and realize that's not the way to do it. The best way to do it is to be better, to do better work, and to do it at less cost. Now, for instance, in the recent flurry of tax-the-rich surcharges offered by the other side, each corresponding spending idea has been clearly directed to appease Democrats' constituencies, mostly unions again. and to build up campaign season talking points that say the only thing standing in the way of Democrats' do-goodery is Republican refusal to tax some easily demonized group. Now, this might make for good politics, but there's no way to formulate fiscal policy, and it is no way to run a country. At first, to pay for a massive new stimulus plan of the president, the Democrats wanted to limit deductions for people earning $200,000 or more, which in September of last year was evidently how Democrats defined who is rich. Next came a proposed surtax of 5.6% on people earning $1 million or more to pay for the president's stimulus scheme. I am guessing that the earlier definition of rich at $200,000 did not sit too well or poll too well with Democrats in high-income jurisdictions in places like New York and California. Next came a surtax of 0.5% on those earners to give funds to states to help pay mostly union workers. Next came a surtax of 0.7% on those earners to help pay for a new Fannie and Freddie-like government-sponsored enterprise called the Infrastructure Bank. Next came a permanent surtax of 3.25% on those earners for what was billed as a temporary payroll tax preference, which ironically gives more to richer earners than it does to poorer earners and gives nothing at all to the unemployed. Next came a long-term surtax of 1.9% on richer earners, again for the allegedly temporary payroll tax preference. Mr. President, the pattern is clear. Democrats settle on their stimulus spending plan of the week, find out how much it will cost, and then find out what surtax to slap on high earners, including business income recipients. That is how we get tax proposals with rates of 5.6%, then 0.5%, then 0.7%, then 3.25%, then 1.9%. Who knows what's going to come next? Never mind the businesses across this country have been clear that massive uncertainty from the current administration's policies and proposals is holding back hiring, job creation, and the economy. It's holding back hiring, job creation, and the economy. Given the past few months of tax rate roulette being played by the Democrats, is it any wonder that families and businesses lack the confidence to take risks, make significant purchases, and grow the economy? And never mind that the Joint Committee on Taxation has told us that approximately 34% of flow-through business income, which tends to be small business income, would be subject to Democrat surtax proposals. But my friends on the other side of the aisle ask us not to mind the effects on job creators, even as the economy faces massive joblessness. If we abide by the recommendations of the editors at the New York Times, who are in lockstep with the Democratic Party, we should not care about more taxes on businesses. Indeed, in a December 9th editorial last year, those tax policy experts told us that. Quote, for any savvy business owner, a surtax would have no bearing on hiring decisions. If new workers are profitable before tax, they will be profitable after tax, even if the employer has to pay slightly more of the profit in taxes, unquote. Now, this view perfectly encapsulates the understanding of the economy held by those who have never created a private sector job or worked to turn a profit. By the way, which includes most all of those in heavy positions at the White House. By this view, these rich business owners won't even flinch if you increase taxes. After tax profitability of hiring does not matter, evidently, especially when you view business earners as those evil rich. Mr. President, I know that in certain circles, it is fashionable to vilify business and hold the profit motive as the root cause of mega wealth. But the notion that business decisions, including hiring, will not be affected in the least by higher taxes is truly bizarre. The ongoing vilification of private businesses in America is shameful. Hardworking Americans who are by no definition rich, but who work in mortgage markets, in real estate markets, in securitization markets, in energy production markets, and in financial markets, have been hit with a blanket indictment from this administration that they are wrongdoers. Of course, if they do wrong, they need to go to jail. But my experience with the American people is that, by and large, They play by the rules, seek to offer useful products to their buyers, and look only for fair rewards for their efforts. They do not deserve to be vilified by the president and painted as purveyors of tricks and traps to abuse their neighbors in order to buy yachts. Again, anyone who breaks the law should go to jail. Any federal regulator who fails to do their job should be fired. But the vast majority of Americans who operate and work hard and honestly in businesses should not be shamed for their work. It would be far more appropriate to shame lawmakers who set trips and traps in the tax code in order to get more money for the federal government to spend, while falsely selling their schemes as paths toward equality. Mr. President, while President Obama seeks to take attention away from his historically record-high budget deficits and federal spending that accounts for 25% of the economy, and his jobs deficit, and his congressional relations deficit, by identifying some sort of, quote, trust deficit, unquote, that he has with financial institutions, it is imperative that he and Democrats in Congress do not spend the rest of this year playing election year politics. People need jobs, and the nation cannot afford to wait for the president and Democrats to get past November. We need to stop the tsunami of job-crushing regulations and the runaway regulatory agencies which continually stretch their authority in order to intervene into the economy and crush job creation. We need to reduce the time needed for private sector projects to clear the forest of regulatory and permitting red tape. We need to proceed immediately with known shovel-ready job-creating and environmentally safe projects like the Keystone Pipeline. Despite having cleared years of reviews and oversight, and despite support from virtually all interests, including unions, but excluding radical environmentalists, it is inconsistent for the president to say that he cares about American jobs while he prevents them from being created by approving the pipeline. While the president needs to approve the Keystone Pipeline, I wish to again express my disapproval of the administration's federal spending pipeline. Mr. President, the administration has lacked for 3 years, any serious and coherent budget plan. The administration has refused to deal seriously, if at all, with tackling unsustainable entitlement spending. It wishes to continue to practice the politics of division in order to permanently enshrine a European-sized federal government that absorbs over 1/4 of the entire size of our economy. Americans do not want this oversized government. Americans do not want or need job-stifling tax hikes. Americans do not need the federal government running their lives and making their choices. Allowing the debt limit to rise would only serve to promote things that Americans do not want and that Americans do not need. Therefore, Mr. President, I disapprove of the president's request for a $1.2 trillion increase in the debt limit, which would place the total limit at nearly $16.4 trillion, and I urge my colleagues to similarly disapprove.